Hello, everyone. We're heading towards the end of the day. Good for everyone for keeping up. My name is Mercedes Watson. I'm one of the volunteers on the Advisory Council for LEAP, and I'm delighted to be here today to be a part of this event. I'm also very happy to introduce our next session, which is Who Am I Now? Mental health issues for athletes and dancers in transition. And I am welcoming to the stage our guests here, which will be moderated by Dr. Nicole Forrester, who's an Olympian and mental health performance consultant with a company called Optimal Zone, Inc. Enjoy the session.
Hi, guys. So I hope to have an enlightening discussion here. I think this morning our first panel kind of started this direction where we're circling back. And I thought I'd start with our athlete here, Krista, to maybe walk us through your own personal experiences as it relates to the transitioning out, your mental health and detraining and all of that you might have experienced.
Yeah, we briefly started talking about it over in the corner, and I'm like, oh gosh. It's the whole whackload of baggage I'm gonna have to bring up here. And I think for me, sport was such a great place for me to find myself. And one of my favorite quotes is, sport reveals character. It doesn't build it, but it reveals it. And I think I got to learn what I was really made of through my sport journey. But as a kid, I was an anxious kid, and I didn't go far from my mom, and I ran home from school when I was in grade 2. I had, some separation anxiety. And when I finished rowing in 2013, I went to 2 Olympic Games, Beijing in 2008, and then London in 2012. I won a silver medal in the women's 8. And after I knew going into that last Olympics, that was going to be my last Olympics, and I finished on a high. So it's interesting, you hear all these stories, and I had one of those high moment finishes, and it felt like a real shift and a real loss after for me. And a lot of the anxiety that I had experienced as a kid and worked through when I was in sport came back. And part of me was like, was I white knuckling it through? Was sport almost hiding and masking for me something that I hadn't dealt with? And so mental health definitely became a thing for me in my transition. Very anxiety, panic.
And so what was difficult about the transition itself for you?
That I didn't know what was next. And I still don't know what's next, but like I was saying at lunch, I'm more comfortable with being in that place now. I joke and say what's next is what's next. But the sheer panic of having you cross the finish line and the mic's in your face, what are you gonna do next? And you're like, I don't know, and then the loss. And so that was really hard, and definitely took me down a route of what I feel uncomfortable giving it titles because I think we use them a little too flippantly in our society, anxiety, depression, all these things. Mm-hmm. But those things that we all know to mean connect with those words were feelings I was feeling.
And so because this is 4 years out now for your transitioning, and you're still transitioning. Mm-hmm. So what has that process been like? What have you experienced? What are you experiencing? And how are you feeling both mentally, physically, emotionally?
I think I kind of inferred, I'm more comfortable with the uncertainty now. I think that it is I wrote a book, Beyond the Finish Line, What Happens When the Endorphins Fade. And what I really wanted to do was just talk about it and share my story so that it could be a place for other people to look to me and go, okay, this is this woman who stands for something so strong. She's got a silver medal around her neck, and she feels this way. She's so vulnerable, and that would allow other people to feel the same way that I felt. So that was a really cathartic process for me, and something that I think was part of my journey. And I joke and I say, if I could have answered that question, the what next question, when I was asked, I would have sounded like a crazy person. If I'm gonna move home to Vancouver, I'm gonna get a Yorkie, then I'm gonna get a French Bulldog, then I'm gonna do a 1-year fashion merchandising program, then I'm gonna write a book, and then I'm gonna do some public speaking, and I'm gonna work with kids. What? That's not an answer. But that has been the journey and the process, and that's okay. And that's what I've become more comfortable with, is just kind of rolling with it and saying yes to pretty much anything and everything that comes into my kind of realm and existence now.
And then from the detraining aspect, how was that? Because how many hours did you train before? And then from going from whatever to 0, so what was that?
Yeah,
transition?
That's one thing that we haven't touched on as much as I'm interested in kind of the science, what actually happens to our bodies. I know dancing as well, there's a body image connection, and for me, having this body image to stand up to being an Olympian, you're supposed to look a certain way. That was a struggle even when I was training. To then shift into a normal body and a normal amount of activity was really hard. I felt like if I wasn't getting up for 90 minutes of activity, it wasn't enough. And now I can do a 30-minute workout and feel like I've really accomplished something. So there was a mental component there, but there was a physical component too. Like I was still hungry for like 5,000 calories a day. Like I could not eat that much. If I did, I would gain weight progressively. So there was a shift that was going on in my body as well as mentally, and I was way more aware of the mental than I was the physical.
So I'm going to move over. So thanks, Krista. I'll come back to you in a little bit. But I'm going to move over to Dr. Hayes and Dr. Ravitz. And if you, what's going on here? Like, why is an athlete or a performer feeling this way and having difficulty transitioning out?
Okay, I'll start. And your story, I think, just brings a lot of ideas to my mind. For one thing, we've been hearing fabulous stories throughout today, and the why seems really obvious. There are lots of changes that are occurring. So, why not? One of the things that I guess I think is really important is to not think of mental health as an either-or. And you were speaking about not wanting to label, and I think that's just so important that, of course, if there is this major change, you're going to feel a whole bunch of stuff, and some of it is not going to be great, and some of it is probably going to be anxiety, and some of it is probably going to be depression, and some of it is maybe having some weird relationships with eating, and all that. And it's a continuum. So it's, I think that's one of the really important pieces that is sort of the normalizing that it's going to feel really uncomfortable. And I think as people have been talking about, it may feel uncomfortable for a while. It may feel uncomfortable in different ways. And one of the things that I often talk with people about through the process of change is actually to take one of the models, the training models in sport of FIT, frequency, intensity, and time, and to think about that in terms of how one is experiencing things emotionally. Am I crying less frequently? Or am I feeling down, sort of less down? Or is it not lasting as long? And that those are kind of going to be measures of how am I transitioning. So those are some first thoughts.
So, both as a psychiatrist, a psychotherapist, and a former dance professional, I think that your story resonates with a lot of experiences of change. And it's normal to feel uncertainty, because it legitimately is uncertain when you've had such structured routines. And it's normal to feel some sadness in the face of loss. It's normal to feel some anxiety or worry in the face of uncertainty. But I think that it's important as well to differentiate that if it gets really extreme, like if you can't get out of bed and you can't stop crying and you're having suicidal thoughts, that you need to connect with a mental health professional or your family doctor. So we don't want to overlook that it can, when it gets to that kind of level of functional impairment, that we know that up to 1 in 4 women in around the world will be suffering from depression at some point in their life, and anxiety is also not uncommon, and there are treatments for it, both psychotherapies. It's helpful to talk. It's helpful to use language. So both in sport and in dance, we become so invested in a world without language often. And so the fact that you wrote that book, which is really cool and amazing and commendable, I'd love to read it, I think is part of the healing process can be being able to just make sense of the experience of change, of the role transition, by using language, whether it's writing, speaking to friends, or speaking to counselors or health professionals. So I think that maybe I'll pause there because I want to give lots of other things.
And actually, I just want to piggyback on that slightly. One of the things that you were mentioning that I think we maybe underestimate here is the mental benefits of physical activity. Mm-hmm. And that there is incredible research on the ways in which physical activity is an antidepressant, is an anti-anxiety, deals with self-confidence and self-esteem. Well, all of these things are occurring during transition. It's going to be different than when one is in training, but whether one has been an athlete or a performing artist, to really take in that some kinds of physical activity is really going to be very helpful to your mental health.
Yeah, and so, Lawrence, in your working with performers, how prevalent do you see issues with transitioning out of performing in arts and in sports, as well as what steps do you do with your athletes and performers to help them transition through this?
It's just been wonderful hearing everybody's stories, yours today and others as well too. And I was a college tennis player. I stopped playing tennis for 10 years, and I also became a psychotherapist. And then when I started working at career transition and career counseling about 15 years ago, I've been bringing an athlete's and a clinical piece to career counseling. So it's always been very interesting to hear what is going on for somebody at any one point in time, knowing that could shift, knowing sometimes that the athlete or dancer themselves are not always sure if it's okay to be feeling what they're feeling or saying what they're saying, or if other people are going to have concerns about that. So it's just so important that as practitioners and as counselors, we're aware of many, many factors, and I'll just throw out maybe 6, and I think there are many more, and Krista has touched on some of them, and some of our other panelists as well. But I think, Paula, when you're talking about using the language, we're talking about trauma. It's a traumatic loss in many cases that we're talking about, because we're talking about not only if one loses one's job, it's income, it's teammates and friends, and a place to go to work every day, and the structure and the status and the perks and the benefits and the fair weather family and friends, that might go along with that. And some of these losses we can expect, and some, are much more unexpected. We're talking about when people burn out, quote, what does that mean? For each person, it can mean different things. Part of it is part of the panic about not knowing what to do next or where to start. And I think sometimes the panic precipitates people wanting to rush or skip steps. And I've met with dancers, let's say, who have just been let go by their ballet company and said, well, I guess I don't know anything else but to work at McDonald's next week, or I have to get a job and I don't have time for this process. And I think that's something that we have to hold and help them slow down a little to see what else is going on. I don't think we've talked about yet, certain folks have a pre-existing mental wellness or mental health condition that can get triggered or re-triggered, and so it's always important to understand about people's history. And I think we're also seeing, and the National Football League has been both the forerunner in this and the cause of this, but really what is an underlying medical or neurological condition that might have an impact on depression or change in behavior, suicidal risk, other cognitive issues that are going along, and also injury. If somebody's been injured and they're transitioning from that point, what's the status in terms of how physically active can one be, as that would be part of what was once hoped for in another career, and maybe that has to be addressed as well. And finally, and I know there are many more, even a normal transition is a crisis. It can be a good crisis, right? There are things that are good in positive crises, but these folks need support and guidance and are not, it's not okay to say to them, well, you don't need help, somebody else does. It's always good to be checking in with them as well.
So that's a good segue over to you. So how has support played a role in your transition?
I think support has been critical. I mean, definitely speaking to the writing and talking. I'm a sharer, so I tell people exactly how I'm feeling. And in that, I was able to get that mirrored response back, whether it was me saying something that, even when I said it out loud, I was like, whoa, that's, reframe, that's not really right. Or someone saying, Krista, come on. Like, you've done so much. Like, this is like, and just helping me get through kind of that low point. Recently, I did a course and we were talking about being in cause or effect. And I think this comes to the support network of empowering athletes to be on the cause side, being in the choice side, being in going and getting what you want versus being in the effect side of this is happening to me and kind of falling into that place, but giving them the strength to be like, no, like I want something, I want to shift, this is my choice, I'm doing this. That's a much stronger headspace to be in than the other side, the effect side. And I've been in the effect side, and some days I'm in it and some days I'm out. And so having that support system to bounce off your ideas is very important. And other athletes spoke to it, whether it's a spouse, a counselor.
Yeah, so that was my next question, because this morning we heard that first panel talk about the difficulty of having a lack of support for some member. So if we try to identify who are those support people, or is it former teammates, or is it your coach, is it a sports psychologist? Like, who are those support people?
I've dabbled everywhere. I've reached out when I was like, somebody help me. My family is obviously that foundation that knows me the best, so they can speak to me as a person. Yeah, so I think they would probably be my first.
And so to my other panelists, what do we know about support or support system? How do they impact or influence the transition for a performer?
I'm going to dive in here because my thing is, one of the things I do is this kind of relationally focused approach to healing and recovery. And I think this is going to maybe sound paradoxic because I know it's maybe not the answer you're pulling for, but I think this is connected to what you just said, that we mustn't forget that there's also holding yourself in mind. Right? And I think that when there are these big life changes, of which, retiring from a professional career as an athlete or a performer is one version of many big life changes that can happen in a lifetime, that there's a sense of loss and there's a sense of opportunity. But part of the loss is like your sense of kind of, who are you? Are you just what you do or what you achieve, or how people kind of see you according to actions only? There's, of course, much more of who we are, right? And so I think to try to widen the frame a little bit and get a more expanded and compassionate sense of yourself in the many ways that we are in life and within all our different relationships with friends and family and former colleagues and friends, and more formal supports like the DTRC or through a professional connection, like for a counselor or physician or health provider. So.
Okay, so that's great. I was kind of going that way anyways.
Okay.
Lauren or Kate, do you guys have anything to add to that?
Would you
The role of the support system, like what?
Yeah.
So I gathered from Paula, like the idea that people are active agents. You, as an athlete or as a performer, you try to figure out a way to create some ownership over your space to seek out that form of support that you can find. Was that correct?
Well, and kind of mentalizing with yourself, right? So it's also being in self-compassion. And being your own support as well, being your own best friend.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So so the question then initially was, what is the role or what the role of a support system? How do they impact or influence the transition for a performer?
So the support system, I mean, the sort of the classic image of it is kind of the self, the direct family, and sort of on and on and on out. Obviously, professional supports being, at least in theory, somewhere sort of way out there. I think sort of picking up on the self as support, one of the sort of classic things very much is that you know yourself better than anybody else does. And so if you were giving yourself advice, or kind of supposing I had a best friend who, what would I say to that person? I think is one way of really figuring out what one needs, and that there are a whole variety of kinds of supports as well.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate. So if you don't know what you're going through, how do you have that reflection? And I'm going to go back to a point that you started to speak about, Krista, is like the detraining element and that body image relationship. So you know yourself as an athlete or as a dancer, and this is what by training this way, this is what your physique looks like. Now you've stopped that level of training, so that changes. So how would you go through that, stepping back and being like, what would you tell your friends when, and we had a conversation about this after where you weren't sure, like, why is this happening?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess one thought that I have kind of a conceptual model. In one of the sessions earlier today on career models, and they were talking about this neutral space where essentially you have been an athlete or a dancer, and you're moving towards something, but you're in this neutral space. One of the ways that I think of it and have understood it is, if you want a visual image, that there are these two hills, and that one hill is who you were, and the other hill is who you're going to become. And there's some space in between, and maybe it's a river. And one of the things when you are no longer who you were, and you may have been shoved down that hill, or you may have walked down that hill, you can't walk back up it. And you don't necessarily know who you're going to become. And so there you are, swimming in this river, and maybe some of the time looking for a rock to hold on to, kind of having some ideas of which pieces of yourself you'd like to move over, but not necessarily really knowing. I know for myself personally, when I've been through various transitions and when I've worked with people, just having a sense of, oh, I'm between selves. I don't know. And that can be very, very freeing.
So, Lauren, did you have something to add to that? That's good. I like that analogy, by the way.
That's great. That's great. I think one of the things we're always concerned about is somebody's feeling that they're the only one going through something. And sometimes when they're stuck, it's so important to have access, whether it's going to be through a video or a friend or a hotline, that there are other people out there who have gone through this, and more of them are putting their stories out, and you are putting your story out for somebody to be reading and writing you back saying, thank you, that's how I feel. And to be having that as a basic level of support, as well as whoever you are identifying as your family and your friends, and go on from there to professional help. But I understand what you were asking, I think, before, when you said that when you're stuck, do you need somebody else to help rock you off, the bottom of the hill or out of that lake, even for a little while. So.
Yeah, like the idea of like, how do you get out of that position, and understanding that that's what you are. Like you're in it. It's like if somebody might be depressed and they don't know that that's what's going on until they come to see you. Like what I was hoping from today is, and with this group, is I kind of wanted to have okay, so here we are, like what to expect when you're transitioning, and then when you're in it, what do you do next? So how is it treated? How do you, what kind of support system do you get? And then like moving forward. So like if we start at the front, at the beginning, and the idea of what would you tell somebody to prepare for this transitioning out of sport or of dance?
Well, I think something that came up earlier, it was said, was that there's a sense that it's changed, that we don't feel alone, and you just spoke to it. I know I wasn't alone in my feeling, but I still felt alone. I still felt like, gosh, why am I having such a hard time with this? And ironically, I was in the women's 8, so there was 8 other women that were going through the similar thing as me, and we didn't actually use each other as much as you would think. And I didn't want to call them and be like the buzzkill. Maybe they were happy. I didn't want to be like, hey, are you struggling like me? And they're like, no, actually, I'm good. Thanks for ruining my day. Like, I didn't want to be that person, so I just left them alone. And so I think it's important to just to know that everyone's going to have a different version of it, but we're all going to go through it. And even for later, because I know Katrina LeMay-Doan spoke at an event, and she said it was creeping up on her like 14 years later. And so she was like, I couldn't run, I ran from it then, but I can't run from it now. And the other thing that I would say is you don't lose that self. And I think for me, when I retired, it was like I was a superhero, and I unzipped my superhero outfit, and I was like, okay, I'm not going to be that anymore. Put it in a drawer and shut the drawer. And then I lost it. And I was like, well, now I don't feel very superhero-ish. But recently, as I've shifted into cause, it's like, I don't need to take it off. Just keep it on and put other outfits on top of it and stay that superhero rock star. So you don't lose the outfit. You layer your outfits. We'll use a styling analogy.
That's right. That's it.
And I think that's so much more powerful than taking off one outfit and throwing it in your storage closet and losing it, because that's just sad, right? And we don't need to do that.
Paula.
So I'm loving this conversation. I think it's really a process of discovery, right? And just how you became an athlete or you became a performing artist. There was a process of discovery and building new muscles and building kind of an awareness of how you can operate and operate at a very high level. And I think the same thing is true in kind of the next chapter of your life, post-performer, post-athlete. And it's a sorting process. I think one of the things you do need to do is stay within a zone of optimal arousal. So if your anxiety or your depression is so high, so intense that you can't get out of the house, you can't think, you need to be able to think and feel at the same time. And sometimes some kind of physical activity, that's something that we all share, is knowing the pleasure and the healing effects of being in your body and having body wisdom. And I think that even in kind of in small doses and in different versions, that can help you stay within that zone so you can figure it out. And that oftentimes there are positive aspects of what you were, whether it's feeling like a superhero or feeling like a kind of very much in touch with your creativity and openness and comfort with not knowing as an improvisational dance artist, that you figure out ways to kind of weave that into the other side of the hill. As using your metaphor. And I think that it takes time, and it does take being connected and supported, both emotionally and socially, with other people and with yourself. But I just wanted to kind of throw that in there.
I see two things here. So I see Krista talking about the idea that as a performer, and I'm grouping, when I use the word performer, I'm grouping dancer and athletes as performers. So the idea that you're performing and your identity might be centered around that. And the idea that yes, you might always be an Olympian, and yes, you might always be a dancer, but that doesn't define who you are. It's a part of who you are, but it's not the sum of all that you're about. And understanding that you can check it to the side, it has another outfit. and then at the same time being aware of how about your arousal level. And when you're not feeling good, that's a time to check yourself and step back and do best practices.
Engage in some kind of self-care. Yeah.
Yes. Anything that you guys want to add?
It's also really important to have the narrative of your own life and to maybe go back, whether it's in an exercise or journaling or having other people give you feedback who do know you, of other achievements you've had, of other obstacles you've faced, and how you have worked through those to be able to use that as in terms of helping yourself and knowing that you have met challenges before, and here's a way to maybe repeat the success you've had.
Okay, so rapid fire. One thing that you will, that someone who is transitioning out will experience, whether that's anxiety, whether that is loss, whether that is gaining weight and their clothes not fitting. What is it? So I'll start with Paula.
Just thinking back to my own transition, I think that it was, that there was a sense of loss and uncertainty just about like, well, if I'm not defined in this way, as a dancer choreographer, then like, who am I? And so I would say some uncertainty and sadness around the loss of that sense of self.
Grieving.
Yeah.
Kate.
Sense of isolation, being the only one.
Interesting. Very interesting.
It's messy in the beginning as well as in the middle.
And at the end.
And then it's totally clean at the end.
So get comfortable with
And there's an
that.
end.
I think to add just to the other things that I've said, I think polarization of feelings. So if you're feeling calm one minute, you're not going to feel calm the next. It's coming for you. Like just a little bit of ups and downs. Some days in complete control, some days not so much.
Okay, so moving into like while you're in the transition, especially when we think in terms of the next phase, when you're in that, you're grabbing onto a rock and you're trying, whether it is trying to find a job, go back to school. How does a performer bridge that gap?
One of the things that has been really striking me is we've been dichotomizing, okay, I was a dancer as an athlete, and I was absolutely certain about, and everything was prescribed. And then I'm in transition, and everything is uncertain. And that dichotomy just doesn't make any sense to me, because there is always uncertainty. Even, yes, you may have a particular schedule, but there may be an injury and it turns out that you're not doing this particular performance, or you may be coming back from it and you may be uncertain about what your body is going to be doing, or did I pass this audition? There are all kinds of uncertainties, large ones and small ones. And so a performer, in this generic sense, has learned many, many skills about dealing with uncertainty. And the kind of self-reflection that you were speaking about, I think is just so useful in saying, what do I know about myself and what kind of ways I cope best?
So that's a really good segue into Lauren, and I saw you nodding your head there. So what skill sets do you feel performers have that will help them in this piece, in this transition?
I guess we're talking about adaptive skills, for both, all kinds of performers. And if I understand what you were asking, we're talking about you've already figured out how to time manage. You've already figured out how to focus. You've already figured out how to take risks. You've already figured out how to show up. I'll never forget that some of my athletes and dancers would say that they started a job, they got there on time, and the boss said, "You got here on time." And the dancer or athletes, well, what, of course. And they said, many other people, they don't show up on time. They just kind of, and it's a given. You show up on time. You have a wonderful presence. You can carry yourself well. Athletes and dancers can communicate with their bodies as well as verbally and in writing, and these are skills they're going to gain. So even applying this to going back to school, some people have been terrified about going back to school. And some of the programs start with a portfolio where you're writing about yourself and your achievements and your skills. So you're reinforcing that for yourself, and you're seeing, again, other people are doing the same thing. And going back at an older age, whether it's 30 or 40 or 50, you're coming in with a lot of life experience and maturity and wisdom, and you're not going to be fooling around as maybe the 19-year-old sitting next to you might have been. You have a family to support, so these are responsibilities, athletes and dancers have been able to carry and can again.
Yeah, very, I like that you identified those different points like time management, focusing, and so forth. So this morning, I keep referencing to the earlier panel because they were fantastic, and I think it connects really nicely here. But we heard of our panelists talk about going out there and trying to get a job and thinking that they'd have these options based on their skill set and still not necessarily having those doors open. So how do you persevere and push through on that, Krista?
For me, I think that I've reflected a lot on this recently and just kind of trying to figure out what it was that made me successful in rowing and in dancing in the arts and all the things that we do that we're passionate about. And I think that we all have examples, whether or not it's even high-level performing, where we've exceeded our expectations because we wanted something so bad. Whether it's like catching that bus and you're like, dude, I was a sprinter right there. Like you were fast in that moment because you wanted it. And it's hard to find that again sometimes, and it takes time. And people will see when you don't really want it. And they're like, well, Krista, what do you really want? And I'm like, I don't know, you busted me. And so it's almost like I struggled with finding that next role because they could see through that I didn't know what I wanted. And so going back to rowing, what drove me, and we talked about this earlier, it was about being a part of something bigger than me. It was about almost helping. I was helping the crew go fast. I wasn't in an individual sport, so that was my experience and my driver. So I would say to anyone, what stops time for you? And if someone needs my help, the clock stops. And so kind of finding that passion and then just trying to put it all places, I think that's super critical in finding the next thing. And
Yeah, I saw Paula, you're nodding, so I'm curious as to what you're thinking.
Well, just a few things to add to this list of the many things that might be generalizable, and that is discipline, hard work, and also what you were touching on is this idea of autonomous motivation. And when I'm finding myself kind of getting thrown back to remembering when I was trying to do organic chemistry as a 30-something-year-old in order to get into med school, and how in my first exam I bombed. I did really terrible. Or maybe it was biochem, but it was one of those kind of hard science courses. And then, just like any, I think, performer or athlete would do, I went to the TA and I selectively disclosed. I told her my story. And she went to bat for me, helped me find a tutor, helped me figure out how to do the drills, how to rehearse, how to perform on tests so that I could get, and I negotiated with my instructor because I knew I had to get an A at my age and with everything else in order to gain entry. And so I think as well that another aspect of the experience of, I think, performers and athletes is you know how to work with coaching and be able to accept okay, I'm not quite hitting it out of the park. I need to, I want to, and being really strategic about getting help figuring out. And of course, there's the DTRC here for dancers, and I know that there are other organizations involved who can help people to kind of push through. And then the last point is that maybe it's okay to take kind of a few runs at different things that might not quite be perfect or might not work, but that there's often something that you discover along the way. So, you have your eye on the goal, but then there's all these doors that might open along the way if you don't quite make it there. And sometimes those end up opening other really interesting kinds of career opportunities.
Yeah, I like how you keep going back to the being autonomous, taking ownership over what you're experiencing, and you're empowering yourself. That theme of that, and as you're speaking, I'm thinking about confidence and understanding what influences your confidence, and as athletes and as dancers, you're used to performing maybe on being one of the best in what it is that you're doing, and that whole hero to zero mentality, but actually you can still apply that skill set in another direction, even though you might lack the confidence there. Kate, do you have anything to add with that?
My thoughts are going in many different directions. I'm going to throw in a quote from Kierkegaard. Life must be lived forward, but can only be understood backward. And to me, what's really interesting is that, again, sort of getting to that new hillside, you may not have a whole lot of clarity about what that hill is going to look like. So maybe what you're doing is just looking at what this next very small step is, and that's going to then inform what the next small step is, and that it's okay not to have the big picture already totally figured out.
All right, so now's a good time to turn back. That's a great way to
great.
and move into the audience. Does anyone have any questions?
Okay, so I guess specifically touching on loss of identity, what kind of coping strategies or what strategies would you give to an athlete who, not necessarily depression or anxiety, but they feel lost or, okay, well, who am I? Like, what am I doing?
Great question.
I think that you're lots of things to different people.
Yeah.
You know, you're a daughter, you're maybe a sister, maybe a mom, a friend, a colleague, a student, an athlete, a performer, and that kind of who we are changes inevitably over a lifetime, and it's also affected by who we're with. So I think to really have a broad sense of who you are helps, rather than it being really narrowly defined by kind of only kind of what you do as an athlete or as a performer. That might be one way of thinking about it that can help you feel a little less unsteady in the process of trying to figure that out.
Actually, one thing that I would add to that, hugely important, is what is important to you in terms of what are your central values. Mm-hmm. And just to throw out one possible way of addressing that, there's a whole lot of work that's been done in positive psychology, including a very accessible measure of your signature strengths. They're going to continue with you regardless of what your particular occupational role is. And if anybody is interested, there is a measure of signature strengths called Values in Action, very accessible on the web. And I find with people that doesn't necessarily give you new information, but maybe some labels for, these are the things that are really important to my sense of who I am.
I think people who are doing career counseling and in helping professions, we're thinking silently as we're checking off some of these ideas. I love the layering idea because I've been telling people add layers, but I like how you say it even better. And other than values and other things, I think it's going to be a very good time to introduce the idea of other interests that you have, other times of your life, things that you liked as a kid or that you had as a hobby, that, adding that at this point helps remind you that there are so many facets of everybody, and some of these might be the ones that are going to spark, a part of what you do next, or even remember what you enjoy again. Mm-hmm.
So I can just add to, in my action, like what I've done with, basically I've done things that these professionals in this area are saying. One of them was teaching spin. So I said I was motivated by helping people. So I got into teaching spin. So it's something different but associated. And I always say, when in doubt, help people out. Yeah. So when you're so focused on yourself and you're like in that hole of being, oh, it's all about me, what am I gonna do? Look for people that need help, because there's a lot of them. And as soon as you extend yourself, it's suddenly like, it's kind of a win-win. So for me, being motivated by that, that's my other example.
I see a question there by Melinda.
So, hello? Yeah. I don't know how to frame this question, but if you read about professional athletes and professional performers that have retired and they're on social media and they're saying, I'm struggling, or they're being vulnerable, and there's an immense amount of wonderful websites that are allowing individuals to disclose how they're actually feeling inside, and hence starting their healing process. But what I'm really curious about, especially with our three esteemed professionals on the stage, is the negativity of the public saying, get over it. Like, you had the life. And how damaging that is to the individuals as they work through this transition. I think of a football player who's bankrupt and in Minnesota that I know that is really trying to figure out how he's going to support his family, and he's of course terrified of CTE and all sorts of things like that. And he posts this, and he did a GoFundMe page, and the comments that the public give to this poor individual that's suffering so greatly with all sorts of things. So I'm really curious on coping strategies that the three of you might give to these individuals, other than just stay offline, but that might help them to not absorb that negativity that comes from people that say, get over it, you had the life, it's art, we're not interested in you. So that's my question, curiosity, et cetera, for you.
I guess certainly one of the effects of social media is that there are all kinds of trolls who can come along. And there was, I think, just yesterday, a female politician who pulled out of the political race, specifically because of the backlash that she was getting. There is something that I learned in moving from the U.S. to Canada, the tall poppy syndrome. You had it so good, let me see how I can knock you down. And
I get that feeling all the time. Just joking.
well, she is the
Very
tallest
tall.
poppy I know.
Literally, the tall poppy.
Big target, right?
But the how do you deal with it? Well, and the third thing I think is that it also speaks, of course, to the stigma of having any problems, and maybe exacerbated by. And you were such a big star, you've had your turn. How do you deal with it? I'll turn to the two of you.
Well, I think it is a good idea to stay off social media sometimes, because it is so toxic as a first step. I'd worked for many years in the AIDS community in the United States, and then I transitioned to doing more career counseling for the last 20 years. And somebody said to me, but dancers, athletes, what kinds of problems would they have compared to somebody with HIV or AIDS? And I said, aren't they entitled to have the best help and support as a person, as anybody else? And most dancers, for sure, and many athletes are not the most rich and the most famous. They're the ones who had a 4-year career or made maybe that $1 million and spread it out. So it's so important for them to be able to stay within themselves, as they have been as a competitor, to be competing and reaching their own goals, rather than be worrying about what other people are saying. Easier said than done, but with a lot of support built in.
Yeah, I just think stigma of of mental illness or of vulnerability is something very real, and that there's a whole literature on it in my world, right, around mental illness. And people are trying to battle that and legitimize suffering and help to try to foster a compassionate and respectful response. But I think as well, sometimes it's helpful to have comeback lines, and if you're feeling strong enough, or if there are others who can be advocates and who can give voice to alternative perspectives and, speak up for people who might not be in a state of mind that they can speak up for themselves. Sometimes that happens. But social media, it's a real, it's a real phenomena, I know right now, and our generation has less experience with it than the millennials and people younger than us. So I think we're still trying to figure it out, and there's tons of cyberbullying and inadvertent communications where people will have terrible impacts on others that they're oblivious to. So I think as well, there's a process of education and sorting that's going on right now, because it could be that people who say that think they're being helpful and they have no idea how hurtful it feels. So I think there's lots of potential ways to respond to that, but it's a really important point that you raise.
And actually, I just want to speak in a way to another side of social media, which is that probably over about the last 5 years or so, I have increasingly gotten calls from parents of adolescents where the adolescent is the one who, a teen athlete in particular, where the teen athlete has, because they have seen so much social media about athletes working with sports psychologists, that the teen has said to the parent, go find me a sports psychologist. Sure. And that is a phenomenal shift. So I think there are also some very positive elements in there.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? I'm anxious to.
Amanda has something around.
Somebody best hand her the mic.
I just feel it interesting to think about labeling to do with identity and the labeling of athlete and dancer from such an early age. And I know that as a dancer, I felt very special because I was a dancer, and I'd been a dancer since I was very young. And I think that is one of the things that makes that particular identity so hard to deal with not being anymore. And I know that we all say, oh, well, we're still dancers, but it's that feeling like that is the only thing that you have ever been. And I just wonder if somehow that specialness is actually creating problems later on.
Does anyone want to take a stab at that?
I mean, I think that's a really good point, and that it might foster more of a focus on self than on helping or on others, like that there might be some imbalance around kind of the identity that develops around being labeled as special. If you're special, then that means that maybe others aren't, and it might create some sense of otherness that disadvantages folks as they get older and enter the real world and try to appreciate that, everybody has strengths and we all have vulnerabilities and we all have abilities and we all have things that we struggle with. So to come to that place of appreciation of humanity rather than being completely identified with being special or privileged or better than others.
I think that's kind of like everybody wants to feel like they're special and that they matter. And, you know, if you're a performer, you don't feel like you're a mere mortal. You've got this extra, you know, I'm a dancer, I'm an athlete, and that separates you. So I'm not sure if that's kind of like what you were alluding to. I saw a bunch of hands like raised when I asked, oh, Judy's got a question. This will be good.
Sorry. No, my one question is just in your experience have you seen any differences between the athletes who were successful and then the athletes who were not successful in their transition and then in their any mental health issues? Because, you know, it's different when you win a medal, but it's different when you don't make the team.
I
but
won
they
the
still
medal,
transition.
and I had the hot mess transition. I feel like I don't think I had a.
Fantastic question.
I'm that athlete that should have had left on a pedestal, and I can only imagine what happens to the athlete that tears the hamstring and doesn't even get to compete at their games, or blows out their back and ends their career and it's robbed from them. But I can't imagine it being much harder than I feel it's been for me. So, I mean, you guys maybe have experience with it, but I speak to that side that looks like the easier side, and it doesn't feel that easy.
I'm going to chime in and be selfish here and share my own experience. So I competed on the national team for like 17 years, and I retired in 2012. And I'm one of the rarity that I did education the entire time that I was an athlete. I planned out my retirement 4 years in advance, felt like I had it nailed. I was excited to retire. And even now, 4 years out, I still feel like I'm transitioning. So I'm not sure there's a true success. Mark Tewksbury is speaking tomorrow, and if you stick around for this, because I heard him speak when I was 4 years before retiring, and his speech prepared me because he had won gold at the Olympics. He was at the height of his career when he retired, and he talked about being in this utter depression. And so understanding ahead of time that I'd be depressed possibly, that finance might be a challenge, understanding that still your identity issue, you're going to have all of that. Like even with all of that, 4 years out, I'm still transitioning with it. So I'm curious if you guys have had a successful story.
Well, I guess my response is that transition is difficult, and it just is, and it's going to be difficult in different ways for different people. But nobody's going to escape it somehow.
Okay, so I like that point, so thank you for making me feel validated. But I think we got another one. We'll leave the last question.
It's good having questions.
Yes.
So we've talked a lot about what the effects are, certainly with regards to a lack of preparation. In your experience or in your opinion, is there anything we can do as practitioners, as athletes, as dancers, to try and inoculate ourselves, the people we work with, against perhaps not eliminating those negative effects entirely, but at least inoculating against the severity of those types of things?
Great question to end on. Who would like to tackle it first?
I'm happy to just talk about this whole idea of work-life balance, right? That Joyce Ann talked about at the end of the last panel, how she had been working with ballet dancers, and this idea of a day off was something that was just, kind of, they appeared to be shocked from her perspective. And so if we can find ways to nourish and engage in activities that give us a sense of pleasure or mastery or rest or joy with different people, so to foster relationships and to foster interests that are aligned with values and with meaning and engagement, I think that helps build resilience to manage the inevitable many changes, including a change of career that we all have to field in a lifetime.
That's nice. Lauren.
Many, many studies have shown that preparation, much earlier in one's career is going to make it a less critical or less rocky transition. And so I think, many of us have tried to implement that, whether as practitioners or with our organizations. And preparing means being in a forum like this, or reading your book, or thinking about, oh yeah, I should finish my college degree or finish my high school degree, or yes, I'm bilingual, so how can I use that? So even just thinking about that there's other parts to life, if not now, then later at some point, is a way of opening that door.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because certainly for me, if I'd waited until 2012 to retire, it would have been a scary sight. So certainly the 4 years probably dampened that effect. How about for you, Krista?
I think from leadership and sport organizations to prescribe, I would have done anything that was prescribed to me that told me I would have performed better. And so having that prescribed and then appealing to the modality with which most of us operate, which the SMART goals, so measurable, whether it's like a booklet of certificates, you did an Excel spreadsheet class, you worked on your resume, short, eat the elephant in small bites kind of thing, but appeal to that modality of achievement. And I think I think that's what's come up for me today. I've been like, how could we appeal to this, that SMART goal setting for athletes, so that it's something they can bite into, rather than being so abyss, too broad, and then we're just like, what? I'll just go for the medal, okay?
Kate, you've been awesome with providing us lovely quotes to meditate on, so I'll close it out with you.
No pressure.
I think in addition to all of these pieces, I would add attitude, that one's sense of experiencing the transition as a challenge that one can be really curious about, and let oneself live within, rather than try to avoid, fix too fast, whatever.
I have one quote.
Okay. Oh, I love it.
T.S. Eliot, Little Gidding, the Four Sonnets. It was the final poem that he wrote in his life, and brilliant, brilliant piece of literature. And there's this one passage, and I'm probably not quite getting it right, so I don't know, maybe Carol, you can help me, or other writers in the room who know it better than me. But there's something about that the end is a beginning, and beginnings are endings, and the end is where you start from.
Love it. Fantastic way to close out. Thank you so much, guys. I don't have any